Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Well Versed. I'm your host, Layman, and today's episode is one that hits really close to home for so many of us. We're talking mental health, generational trauma, identity, and healing. I'm super excited about the guest that I have today. I've been following her on TikTok for some time now, and I love how she breaks down a lot of these concepts. She is a licensed therapist, a clinical director, and the founder of Therapy in Color, which is a platform and practice centered around culturally informed therapy, keyword culturally, and mental health access for people of color. So, Samar, thank you for joining Well Versed.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you on. Just because, like I said, I've been following your content and yeah, you speak to a lot of things
Mhm.
that are not readily accessible on the internet, especially for people who are looking for resources.
Mhm.
So, before we kind of get into it, I would love to know what inspired you to become a therapist and then what ultimately led you to start therapy in color.
That's such a great question. I really appreciate it. The really great answer for this question when I get asked is, I just really wanted to help people. And that's not the fact of the matter. Like, that's not why I became a therapist. I became a therapist very early on in my life. I think I was one of the youngest interns at my practice site when I started. And the reason wasn't, I do want to help people for sure, but the reason why I really gravitated towards mental health and psychology particularly was because just of my surrounding. I noticed how I would really lean into talking to people and how I started becoming a safe person in my environment for a lot of people.
Mhm.
And then I was like, oh, I also give advice, which therapy is not about giving advice. But when I was really young, I was like, oh, so there's this natural skill I started to pick up on, and I would notice how simple it was for me to have conversations. So I was like, what if therapy is a place that I explore? Like, I value this. I feel like people can talk to me. I can do some good in the world, and I'm also like, like that auntie is very much alive in me that loves gossip. So it was like, how do I do this in a non-toxic way? How do I like get all the tea without like
I love
without
that.
it turning into an issue?
How do I get your tea but also help you?
So and this is the honest fact. I was like, okay, like let me try out therapy. And I was originally gonna go into psychiatry because immigrant family and brown. So my family was like doctor. And I was like, okay, let me try it out. But I think this just naturally led me down this path, and that's how I started up. And this is the only profession I've ever known. I don't know unless teenage years count. And I used to be like a DJ on like a radio radio station for like a hot summer. So yeah.
I love that. And what were kind of like the biggest gaps you noticed and kind of why you wanted to get into it as well? Like, were there specific gaps you noticed in the community that you were like, I need to kind of focus in on here? Because you are very, I wouldn't say niche, but you do a specific type of therapy and you speak to specific topics
Mhm.
as well.
That's again such a good question. And I think when I was in school and when I was training, I didn't see any of it because you have to really understand that I got my training at the Maple Center in Beverly Hills, and these are predominantly white spaces. And these are predominantly, we're centered. I wasn't seeing South Asian people. I wasn't seeing a lot of people of color, even though
Yeah.
we catered towards um low income people. I was still being trained in a way where I wasn't being exposed to anything besides what schooling was and the population that they allowed me to work with at that time. So the options that were given was either you go to like South LA and they're like centers there. It's where you got in, right? And then you work with a very specific type of, Latino or black population. I got
Mhm.
into the Maple Center and we were in the heart of Beverly Hills, and it's weird where it's like a
Interesting.
low in yeah, it was weird that's a low income clinic in the heart of Beverly Hills, you know?
That's so random.
It is very random, but people would come and people would need therapy, but predominantly they would be, underprivileged, but predominantly they would also be white.
Mhm.
So I didn't see a need because I didn't understand a need. And I think there is some value in this, and this is might be a little controversial, because I didn't project on my work. I didn't go from a place of like, well, I needed this and there's a gap and I need to do this. And I have
Mhm.
a lot of gratitude during that time because there's a hesitation I have to talk about personal experiences when I come on podcasts or do any sort of like talk, is like I never want people to think that in order to heal myself or heal something in me, I went into these things and I
Mhm.
sought that, and that's how it turned into profession. Not that there's anything wrong in that. It's just something
Yeah.
I don't do. And it's something
Mhm.
that I want my practice to be very separated from. So the way I was trained was to be a blank slate. I don't tell you anything about me. My clients to this day, I think out of like 100 and like 100 to 400 clients, like 4 to 5 people knew which city I lived in, or knew if I was ever traveling, or knew what age I was, or knew whether even I had children or a partner. Because the
Mhm.
way I was trained was you don't project on your clients, the space is theirs. And I loved the way I was trained at Maple Center, even though it was predominantly a very, specific population I worked with. The training was invaluable. But the going back to your question as to how did I find the gap, it came later. It came it came after I graduated, and it came after I started spending a little bit more time outside of Maple Center, and I was in different areas trying to like see what's going on in the world in terms of mental health. Because a lot of Desi people, like South Asian people, Middle Eastern people, Black people, weren't necessarily coming out exactly back in like 2018 with their mental health stuff. But there were creators before me. Like Brown Girl Therapy is a great example of someone who was already starting to have conversations about that. But I found her after I created my niche too. So
Mhm.
that's kind of like where I saw the gap was afterwards. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that you said that about the not speaking to kind of or bringing your experiences into it, because that's something I've experienced from therapists in the past. And I know it's not intentional, it's kind of like a relatability thing, but sometimes there is no relatability. Like you may have the exact same experiences or same background, but not
Yeah.
going through the same thing. So I love that you mentioned that. What does culturally informed therapy actually mean in practice?
So culturally informed therapy. So the gist of it is that no one can be 100% culturally informed in every culture. This is
Yeah.
impossible. There are too many cultures. There's cultures within households as well. So it's not just a culture from country. There's a culture within region. There's a culture within household. There's a culture within friends.
So deep.
Yeah. And that's my favorite saying is common sense isn't common, not because people are stupid, is because
Yeah.
our common sense was formed within our cultures. And if it
Mhm.
differs, it'll look different.
Yeah.
And culturally informed means that we take that knowledge at all times and we keep it right here as a therapist. Be aware that you are not asking your clients to be your anthropological teachers, your sociological teachers. It is your responsibility when you work with certain populations to have at least a certain understanding. Then, if you know that, you go and you educate yourself as much as you possibly can. Obviously, there are nuances. Obviously,
Yeah.
your clients and the people you work with will inform you of the nuances of your life, but I want to make sure majority, not all, because there will be things that I just don't know. As a human being, there's only so much research I can do, but majority of the time a client's perspective should remain on their own experiences and perspectives, and I need to come up with the 80% of other knowledges, like my treatment plans, my diagnosis. My diagnosis is in reference to working with a Native American person. My reference is research working with someone who grew up in, South LA and whose, grandfather was part of the Bloods and the Crips. Like, and these are like communities I have worked with. I'm not
Yeah.
going to go in and work with people like that without having a sense of what does it mean to be a grandchild. Not saying I worked with the grandchild of that, but I worked with a lot of the people within those gangs, and coming in, you know, and and being, I see as offensive by saying ridiculous things like, well, have you ever talked to your parents about like moving out? Like a gang is really dangerous. Have you ever thought about like not being gang affiliated? Like gangs are not like that. Like I'm never going
Yeah.
to go into therapy and challenge an identity off the bat. I need to
Yeah.
understand what gang culture is. I need to and I'm giving a very extreme example of this, but like I need to come in and understand these things if someone is coming to me for help, right?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to remove them from what they know. I need to know why they're in it and why is it significant. And that's
Yeah.
what culturally informed is. Like with South Asians, right? We have a very traumatic, not everyone obviously, but it is, we have a lot of trauma rooted within us. The subcontinent, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, we were colonized by the British. And even our body composition has trauma, right? Like we're known for being a population that has the highest level of PCOS, and we have fat that we hold in our gut because our bodies got used to famine, right? Now if you know
Yeah.
that and someone's coming to me and they're having body dysmorphia and they're starving themselves and they're doing all these things and I don't know this information, right? And I'm like, have you tried, going to a nutritionist? Have you tried a calorie deficit? Have you tried all these things? I'm trying to give them a solution rather than understand what it means to look a certain way, being South Asian, attraction, understanding all those other things that make up culture. And these are predominantly very important because it's already difficult for people to come into therapy. It is already hard for people to trust providers and not give up, not give up on themselves. And when you talk about culturally informed, it's not one definition, it's all of this. It's being aware, it's being mindful, it's not taking on a client that you feel like you're not a good fit for because you don't have knowledge and it's complex. What if you have a Muslim client and you have a Muslim
Mhm.
client who's Indian?
There's
And they,
layers. Yeah.
yeah, and they were beat as kids, and you know what? Their parents beat them up right now. And you're like, well, that's domestic violence, and you need to leave the household, and you need to distance yourself from your parents. If that's the first place you go,
Yeah.
you already lost your client. You
Yeah.
already
I'm
lost.
smiling not because that it's
Mhm.
funny. It's definitely not funny, but because like what you're saying resonates so much because it's not a one size fits all. It's very nuanced. And
Mhm.
so I appreciate therapists who really take the time to kind of understand, okay, like what is your culture to you and what is
Yeah.
like the background behind your culture? Because like you said, someone who's experienced something like that, it's not easy to just be like, okay, well, that was
Mhm.
abuse. Cut your parents off and never talk to them again.
Yeah.
That
Like
doesn't
that's
work.
not an option. Yeah, and it's
It's not
not
an
an
option.
option for a lot of us. And the
Yeah.
option isn't even fear, it's love half the time. Like
Yeah.
you have to then sit there and you're asking a person to measure between love and safety. And that is exactly what domestic abuse and violence is at times. And
Yeah.
it's so complex in its nature. And that's why the therapy that I do is long-term therapy. Because I'm not trying to give you a quick fix in your situation. I'm trying to make sure that the decisions that you take, we don't take the most extreme decisions first and we have an understanding of what's going on. Hmm.
Yeah, definitely. One thing you talk a lot about so clearly in is intergenerational trauma, about things like guilt, shame, obedience, things like that, that can be passed down in generations. So, for someone listening, how do you define intergenerational trauma um, who might not recognize it in their life?
Oh, that's a really good question. Intergenerational trauma, as the word, like the words are connected, right? Like inter and generational. It's trauma that has been passed down from generation to generation to generation. It doesn't look the same every single time, but you know that it's something that, we've carried on. And the best community, and in the most unfortunate way, is, African Americans who came to America, right? That is generational trauma. When you
Yeah.
look at a history of systematic oppression, you're watching how which generation keeps absorbing similar trauma patterns, right? For example, an anxiety response when a cop is there. That's generational trauma. Your parents taught you to be worried about this. You are now riddled with anxiety. You are now, acting a certain type of way that is traumatizing to you. Because as a kid, imagine someone sitting down and explaining this is what you need to get done. That's a version of intergenerational trauma. Another version of intergenerational trauma, the classic is, your grandma beat your mom beat you. Here we are, and you're sitting here even more confused because you have more access to information and education, and you can't wrap your mind around why someone would hit a child for crying. That's intergenerational trauma. Trauma and traumatization that is passed down from our people, our families, our cultures, our communities. All of that constitutes as intergenerational trauma.
And how does that show up when you're working with your clients in therapy, especially? specifically, and I don't want to batch, I know it's a different experience for everybody, but specifically children of immigrant parents, which I'm so happy there's more discussion
Mhm.
around this topic because for me, as someone who's like first generation Ethiopian parents, they immigrated to Canada.
Mhm.
There was so much nuances in growing up from like religious context and, the strict culture that I grew up in to just like, children should be kind of seen and not heard, and just like the respect and obedience you have for your parents. Your parents define your identity, what you do, where you go, who you speak to. Like it's very, very deep and it shapes a lot of who you are. So though I don't want to group it, I do notice that there were some commonalities with some of my friends, like South Asian communities, Islamic communities, and things like that. So I'm curious, what are some patterns you do recognize in terms of
Mhm.
intergenerational trauma for
Mhm.
these groups in your like in working with your clients?
I think the classic example is that they really internalize everything that their parents have told them. And when they're trying to, when they have a seed of awareness that, oh, I might want something different, that inner conflict is the biggest indicator. So it's kind of like a classic example is like arranged marriage, where they're doing their best to be like, well, I have an arranged marriage and I need to get married by this time. And they're from the ages of like 22, 21, going
Mhm.
into their 30s, and they're having a really rough time with the concept and the idea, and they're not relating to anyone. And they'll come in and be like, okay, so you want to be married. And they're like, well, eventually, but my parents want me to be married right now. I was like, okay. And what are you doing? Well, I'm going on all these dates and I'm feeling burnt out and I'm feeling like I'll never find someone to even just like cohabitate with mentally. So I'm like, what about the concept of love? Well, like love is so unpredictable. Like, I like, yeah,
Yeah.
it is
Crazy.
that, right? And
Yeah.
it is something that they completely embody and adopt from their parents and trying to satisfy that part. But in turn, it's causing them a lot of distress and panic because it isn't necessarily maybe in complete alignment with them. Not to say that there haven't been really successful relationships with arranged marriages, there have for sure.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but that's just an example of one of the things that I see. Or that same thing where it's like, I'm not happy and like my parents are doing all these things where I can't, I never was allowed to make friends in school because family came first and I'm really lonely. And like my family does come first and they're my priority. But now what you've done is you've adopted this, you know, isolated experience within the family environment sort of thingamabobby, right? And this person has to function within a Western society and has to go to work and is perpetually lonely. And there is no
Yeah.
fix for that besides, I guess, getting married.
Yeah.
So these
What
are
are the
like,
consequences of that? Like when you have that misalignment? Because so I've had friends, from my personal experience, I had friends who came from like immigrant families whose parents were a bit more flexible and open and adopted to like Western society. And so I saw how they moved around and how they were better adjusted. And then I seen the reverse of my group of friends who parents kind of, I hate to say it, wanted to raise us the way they grew up back home, which just doesn't match, just doesn't work, right? Um, how do you work with people to get through that?
so that's where therapy really comes into play, right? That's where treatment is. It's like, then we have to sit there and work through your guilt. We have to work through, I like the miracle question. It's one of my favorite questions to bring up in therapy, where it's like, if I'm like a magical therapy fairy, right? And I like swing my wand around and I could change anything about your life, right? Like anything that you wanted, what would your life look like? The crazy part is half of these people don't know how to answer that question because they don't think about it and
Really?
they've never fantasized about these things. When you think
Yeah.
you have options, that's what allows you to dream. Some people just don't have the options, so they don't dream. And then I recognize, wow, this person hasn't had a time to establish their own identity. They haven't had the time to dream. They haven't had the time to understand any of these things. So before I get you there, I need to help you reconcile your guilt, your shame. I need you to, the biggest concept that people right now I feel like just don't understand. And this is my personal resentment right now. Like I have extreme resentment towards communities that bullshit therapy and put out crap, because now I have to work 10 times as hard to bring the reality, because the most important thing is that as human beings, it is okay to disappoint. It is the most natural of things. And I have to help them sit there and being like, if your parents are upset, it's okay. If you're upset, it's okay. Be upset.
Mhm.
And they're like, yeah, but I don't like this feeling. And I think therapy for some people has become a new avoidance technique where it's like, well, I feel bad. I need to go to therapy. Great, go to therapy. You're still going to feel bad. I'm just going to teach you how to cope with it. I'm not
Right.
eradicating the emotion. I'm here to help you learn this human behavior, which is disappointment, which is rejection, which is hurt, which is pain, and learn to deal with it so it doesn't overcome you.
Mhm.
And that's what we learn in this. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when you kind of like work with your clients through that guilt, through that shame, and they kind of come on the other side where maybe they form a bit of their identity, they know what
Mm-hmm.
they want. Part of that means coming back to maybe your triggers or your traumas or the environments and families that you're surrounded by and working as this kind of like new person or new expectations, which is really difficult. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how do people manage doing that, especially when it's something that's difficult because that whole concept of love and respect for your families exists. And also, sometimes a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
parents are very stuck in their ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that whole idea that we talked about earlier of, okay, well, they don't agree with what you want to do, who you are, who you want to date, whatever it may be, you're not going to cut your parents out. So, what do you do? How do you slowly work with your parents on whatever sort of issues
Yeah.
or things that you want that are maybe not aligning with what they want for you?
Again, great question because you're going to therapy for yourself, not for your parents, right? So I think the first thing, depending on who your parents are, is understand that changing them is not the point. We're not sitting here to get you to a place to change them. That's the first part. Doesn't mean that they can't. Doesn't mean
That's
that
good.
we can't work on having conversations with them. But that shouldn't be the focus because that's a very painful focus, especially like you said, when parents are really rigid. If I'm trying to put a boundary on you and you can't even accept that, how are you supposed to accept these bigger conversations? So one of the techniques that I love is the breadcrumbing technique for parents, where it's like start with boundaries. You know, I'm going to give them coping skills surrounding their triggers and all those things. But for family members and going into those environments, use your coping skills to cope and then breadcrumb.
Mhm.
You need to be and this is, people hate it when I say this, when they're like, well, why do I have to be emotionally regulated? Because you want the relationship. They are
True.
not changing, and you've said it and you've done it and you've presented it in your way, right? The anger, the hurt, and the pain that comes out, which is fine to go out there and do it, but to achieve some of the things where it's like, I want to connect and I want to bond, it comes with this technique where you have to go into these spaces and you have to be more controlled. You have to be regulated. Doesn't mean what they're doing is okay. It's just that if you're going to start yelling at them, they're not going to listen to you, you know? So if
Yeah.
you're emotionally regulated and you can get to a place of back and forth by being curious and inquisitive, sometimes it can soften things up. And to be quite honest, like over age, these parents who are really strict do soften. And I think it's because they're tired more than anything else. I don't think they like
That's
philosophically
it.
actually tired.
They're just exhausted.
Yeah, they don't have the energy to put up with the bullshit. Like, do all the, be
And
back on
they're
their bullshit.
vulnerable. They're
Yeah,
old and
exactly.
vulnerable.
Now they're like, we're old. And you're like, well, why aren't you treating my younger sister the way you treated me? And they're like, well, it's just different now. And it's like, damn,
Yeah, it
fair
took
enough. That's
time, but
how
we
it
got
is.
there. Yeah. So, okay, so what is this breadcrumbing? Because I've only heard of breadcrumbing in the context of dating and that kind of breadcrumbing, but what does it mean to breadcrumb in the context of your relationship with your family or your parents?
So it's the same thing, right? Like, we're just being just as manipulative here. I'm going to say it because it's true. Like, it's the fact of the matter. You go to family events and you're kinder, you're softer, and you start like playfully. Like, I made a video recently about like how to tell your parents about your white boyfriend, and that breadcrumbing was brought up where it's like before you tell them you're dating anyone, like sit with your parents and watch TV, right? And if there's someone cute, like cheekily be like, "Oh, isn't that like cute?" And like depending who your parents are, they could like, take that really offensively. But you're kind of like tongue in cheek way of gauging. You're
Yeah.
trying to gauge through this technique of how far you can push them in what conversations. So you start with that. Then it's like you have a moment, you take one of your parents out, and then you're like talking about like, okay, what was love like in your age? Okay, what did you think love was gonna be? And you're like trying to like extract more information from them to have an understanding. Then the next time you're like, okay, this is what I think about love, right? And then you present that, and it's like a long ass method, a long ass duration of you basically slowly but surely priming them that you're
Mhm.
thinking about this, you're talking to them about this, but it is on ground zero. It is neutral, it is gentle, it is very inquisitive, it is courteous, it is all those things, and it's frustrating. A lot of people can't do this because they
Yeah.
get mad so quick where it's like, oh, I wanted to, and I'm like, what you're trying to achieve looks like this. And then by the
Mhm.
end of it, we're talking about a 2, 3, 4 month time period of you building this sort of a relationship with them, you know, talking about attraction, talking about these things, and then you talk about like, okay, I have to tell you a secret, you know? And everything is playful and everything is gentle. Some parents will be okay with this. Other parents will probably kick your ass. I really can't gauge. You have to be my client for me to know
Yeah. You got
which
to
one
check
works
in.
right in your life. Yeah, because it
Yeah.
doesn't work for every set of parents. This only works where there is a little bit of wiggle room for that.
Yeah. I totally agree there. And yeah, I think some people, I don't know, it's so weird. I've a lot of people fear their parents. Um, and then I think with age, people have less fear, but sometimes a lot of that fear is also created in your head and you're living in your former child self. The breadcrumbing makes a lot of sense, because it also allows you to kind of get an idea of where they stand and like, test the waters a little bit.
For sure.
Um, and then we also don't talk to our parents a lot about those things as well. I find like sometimes our parents and how they raised us in certain critical moments in our lives were
Mhm.
one way, but when you actually transition into the adulthood, they see you a bit differently, but we still think that they're the same parents we had when you were
Yeah.
like 15. And in some elements they are, but in other ways, we never ask those questions. You just made me think I've never asked my mom, "Oh, how was love for you?" Like, I don't know. My parents had an arranged marriage, so
Yeah.
I've never asked her.
Yeah, absolutely. And like just like you were saying, right? It's like we don't think to ask these things because there's no room for it. And sometimes like they don't create an opportunity to have that kind of closeness when we're all just trying to like be together and be a family, you know?
Yeah. When does the intergenerational trauma or triggers become too much? Have there been scenarios when you're working with your clients where um, maybe the suggestion is to take some time away from those parental relationships?
Definitely. I mean, like I have quite a few parent clients where we've gotten to that point. There are like certain things. One is that the abuse just never stopped, right? And it is like I can give you all the coping techniques in the world, but if you're still like so trigger sensitive because you feel mentally unsafe around them, and that mental safety isn't coming, like at that point it becomes like a cost benefit analysis. How much of yourself are you willing to give up to keep this going? And if you constantly the relationship only has guilt, shame, and anger, that time I will be like, okay, and how is it seeping into your life? The the biggest way to gauge it is how does it affect your adult life?
Mhm.
I'm not talking about like a once in a while blowout with your parents. I'm talking about every time they're texting, every time they're calling, you're just in crisis mode. You can't regulate, it affects your mood. And the biggest thing is the people around you start treating poorly because of them, or you can't form relationships because of them, you know? And I've seen this time and time again. People just don't know how to make friends, don't know how to be in relationships. That's the biggest one. That is actually, I think, the biggest thing I've seen in the past like three
Talk
years.
about that. I'm really curious. Like, how does the
Yeah.
parental experience affect just
So
people's relationships?
so I think like well my dad treated my mom like this and not in a good way, right? It's like there's a submissive and a dominant thing. So I always need to be a dominant one so I can never be in the pattern of my parents. And
Mm.
now when you date, you seek that out. And it's like, okay, well that doesn't necessarily need to be your experience. And then you have to go in and break it. The bigger thing is that within collectivistic cultures as a whole, I've seen this across the board with almost like every collectivistic culture, which is like cultures that are more like not individualistic, that have more community based in it, is that if academics was a really big priority, right, they are starting to date later in life. I'm talking about I see girls who haven't had their first kiss or haven't gone on a date until like not even college. They're like
Yeah.
graduating and they're not having these experiences and they're developing insane amounts of fear. That's
Yeah.
the biggest one. Mm-hmm.
It's almost I've seen that a lot too. It's I don't want to use the word regress. I've seen that where like it goes too far that there's sort of like a fear and a regression in like maybe intimate relationships.
Yeah, I mean, like, imagine if you'll always feel behind compared to your other peers. That's one thing. And I mean, comparison is like the joy of thief. What? Is a thief of joy. Whatever. But still, like, for you to be able to go in and feel okay dating and it being an enthusiastic thing. I think people are having sex a lot later in life, and like, there's just so much anxiety. And it's
Hmm.
not just anxiety, there's also this like imaginary standard that people have going into the dating scene that is really bizarre and unrealistic. Like I don't want to say back in my day, but like
When you
back
were 10?
when I was 10. But when I was in my younger 20s, and I'll give this example because it's really important to note this. We weren't like, oh, does this guy have a six-figure salary? And like, can he buy me like I was out of college, this person is out of college, they're working as a waiter. I'll come after your shift. Can you comp me some pizza from your restaurant? You'll sit on the sidewalk and you'll eat and you'll talk, and maybe if it's a good day, you'll make out and it's done.
Yeah, and you're like,
And
you're so nice, and I laughed and like,
and you're poor, I'm poor. Like I'll buy us, some Diet Cokes. You get, just, whatever you get as a meal from your restaurant. Let's split it and let's sit on a bench somewhere and like call it a day. I find it so challenging when the bar has been raised to the most bizarre standard.
yeah,
I'm not talking about courtesy. I'm not talking about chivalry of like someone just being like, nice to you, like opening a door, sorry. Yeah, opening a door, being mindful of your surroundings. I think it became
yeah,
so monetary that people have like literally taken a gun and shot themselves in the foot and in the face at the same time. Where it's like, well, I'm not gonna do this if they're not like that, and I'm not gonna do this if they're not like that. And to be quite honest, I don't think it's the standard. You just made sure to like clusterfuck yourself into a box where you can't date anymore, you know?
yeah.
There's
I
no
feel like that,
tolerance.
yeah, that has to do. I don't think maybe parental could have some play in that, but I also think that's just like social media today,
That
this
is social
crazy,
media. That
unrealistic
is
expectation.
that is social media. And yeah, that is not 100% parental, but it can be. So for example, if you're like, so this is a different way trauma plays in, right? Talked about what it does it mean to be a daddy's girl. How do daddy's girl, being a daddy's girl, like create trauma? And the really funny part is that this is what it looks like. You have, as a parental figure, as a father figure, you either spoil and create impractical life circumstances for your children that they can't cope with the real world when everybody doesn't yes man them. You completely took away the
I've never heard
opportunity.
that,
I
but that makes
know.
sense.
Isn't it crazy? Because
But it's
you.
like
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard that because it's daddy's girls are so glorified. Why wouldn't anyone want a dad that gives you everything you want, treats you like a princess, says yes, yes, yes? Like how could that ever be have bad
Wrong.
consequences?
Because the consequences, and it's not always the case. The
Yeah.
consequences is extreme entitlement, um, not being able to handle rejection, which is part of human life, right?
Mhm.
It's almost like those people when they go through rejection, they go through crisis.
Yeah.
Um, not being able to, and actually, a lot of those daddy's girls that I've talked about have the hardest time being in relationships. Hardest.
Yeah.
They're the quickest to bail, and they're the quickest to get angry in a situation where their needs aren't met. That is exactly what I'm talking about. The
Yeah.
pattern in a relationship. And it really does come from parents. Similarly, a mama's boy, right? I know
See,
these are
that's
like
what
gender.
people like talk about more too. I feel like the mama's boy gets
Exactly.
like a lot of flack. Yeah.
Yeah. And they get it in terms of their moms prioritizing, like them just wanting to hang out around their moms. But in reality, it is what a woman has catered, neck and knee to their son. The expectation is I'm going to date a girl and she's gonna do exactly this. And if she shows up short, fuck her.
Yeah.
And these are things that people don't realize harms them from coming into, like, not everybody needs to be in a long-term relationship, but intimacy is a part of the human experience. We are social creatures, we are human beings. Love is a part of our DNA. You know, community and friendships are so important, and a lot of these people have a hard time with all of those things in their community, you know.
Yeah. And that even like makes me think that it's even more important to recognize that intergenerational trauma and try to solve for it because you save yourself in so many other avenues, like you said, with friendships, with
Mm-hmm.
dating, if you kind of address that early on. But you also mentioned religion. What role does, I don't want to use the word extremism in religion, but what role does like a strong level of religiousness play in the household and people's relationships with their family, and what are the consequences of that?
I think you said it properly. When you say extremism in religion is actually the correct way to literally say it, because
Mhm.
religion, like, on its own, when it's not extreme, is like chill. Like, we go to church, we go to the mosque, we celebrate Eid, we get cute, we get money, vibes, right? But when religion
Right.
turns extreme, right, that's where the problems start to occur. Extremism and cults are actually one of my niches too that I work with. I don't know how I fell into this, it just did happen to happen. And there I still do. I work with quite a few people who used to be like in former cults or who used to be part of like extreme religions, whether they're like Islamic religion, like Islamic, like Muslim extremists, Christian extremists, like Mormonism or something like that. All of that I've been working with. I've dabbled a little bit with people who are like extremism, like Orthodox Judaism, but not too much.
Mhm.
Um, but it's all there, and the biggest thing is it's very similar. Where it's like you've been given a code of conduct to follow your whole life. It's not about happiness; it's about a peace in God. And what you're doing is trying to get to these like to these other levels, and it's about complete self-sacrifice, and that is really difficult. Like working with clients like this like opened my eyes to a whole new, you know, like there was so much work, so much research that had to go in. And I come from, like, you know, South Asia, so like at least with extremism I had an over average understanding of exactly what that could look like. But it is even more, it's like the same thing: shame, guilt, pain, glorifying suffering, you know, all these things contribute towards, you know, mental health issues, anxiety, you know, hypersexualization. That's a pretty common one. Um,
Or the reverse, maybe too. I don't know.
I mean, yeah. So the thing is, like, yeah, there's like extreme suppression that then comes out in like weird ways, and when you reject that, and when you suppress it, it will come out in interesting ways. My favorite example is this comedian. I think this is Bangladesh comedian who was, you know, he was like extremely Muslim, but he was like Muslim enough, and he was like, you know, I did this
Wait,
thing. He talked about, you know, how he was 12 years old, and you know, life was great. He loved his friends. He went to the mosque and it was a chill vibe. He was like, I wasn't traumatized. But he was like, you know, all of a sudden, like, in the middle of the night, I was 12 and I would take off my clothes and I would go and stand like naked in my yard just to feel the wind. And he was like, until I didn't go to therapy, I didn't realize what it was about. And that's the thing, the body
that's
needs
funny.
a release.
No, he didn't know what was going on. He just knew he went
Exactly.
outside and had to feel
And
the wind.
and the first time he touched a boob, he cried. Like,
Is
yeah.
that what he said? Oh, that is such a good comment.
So like when you look at it, like it's very not obvious what starts to happen, but like religious extremism and cults can cause developmental delays, can cause social isolation. Like I said, mental health issues. Like you're not human beings aren't meant to be cattle and herded towards such rigidity. It's
Yeah.
not in the makeup of us, you know? We like structure, we like routine, but when you put people in these extreme environments, you create opportunities for violence. You create opportunities for, you know, entitlement and what is it called? You know, self-righteousness, and it creates narcissism as well. You know, like if you talk
Mm.
to certain people and you're like, well, and you challenge them, they'll always do like a condescending smile, like, oh,
Yeah.
like, you don't know. I'm just like, I'm just asking a question. There doesn't need to be self-righteousness and conversation and debate, you know.
When do people who come from that very religious extremism eventually come to you? Is it early on, or does it take a long time for someone to get to you? And
It's really tough, to be honest. Like early on it comes in if they have like someone who like a parent or a sibling who also like got out of it, but I've never worked with someone very young. I've always worked with like older people. Like I've worked with, I think, mid 20s into 40s, late 40s, but never early
Wow.
on. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
Wow. I'm just imagining in your late 40s kind of having to unpack a lot. That's like a lot of
Oh
life
yeah.
lived.
Yeah, it's a lot of regret. And it's a lot of like missed out on opportunity, right? It's a lot of sadness and grief. You're grieving a life you lost trying to abide by these rules and regulations, and it's also grief of losing a community. That's really hard. You know, like these people are who you've always known, and in order to live a life for yourself, you sometimes have to distance yourself from them, and it can cause immense amount of pain because you still love them, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah, and it's also kind of twisted too because it's the only community you have, and then it's the community you're walking away from. So it's kind of like
Oh yeah.
you have no one.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so much of your work is about obviously like helping people and breaking cycles. What does real-time healing look like? What are some signs someone is actually breaking the cycle, even if it still feels hard?
So one of the things is that it's more in your conscious mind, right? Like there are tools and there are these observations and processing that we've done, and now your mind outside of therapy is starting to process. So like
Mhm.
when you're in those situations, it's like, oh, you're catching yourself. You might not be able to 100% regulate, but the process has started, right? You're you're doing your homework sometimes. Nobody does their homework.
No one does the homework. Do you give homework?
Oh yeah, I do. And I personally hate giving homework because I'm
Yeah.
really bad at if my therapist gave me homework, I wouldn't do it either. So like I get it, but everyone's terrible at it. But it is like a necessity. There are a few things. There are different forms of therapy. So there's CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. That's very homework heavy, and that's all about
Okay.
remapping how you think. It's not about what you're feeling. It's about changing the way that you think. So that's the
Okay.
primary focus. And a lot of models, like Alcoholics Anonymous, follow a very similar modality, but they have their
Mhm.
own modality, which is MO. That's the whole thing. I do psychodynamic psychotherapy, meaning that majority of the work that I do is all about understanding how do we get here in the first place. For me,
Mhm.
I give a lot of respect to the past, and then how you act, how you think, how you emote, how you make decisions in the present. And then I need to take all that information and then go into treatment. So there are two things, or maybe more. It depends on how I explain this. So this is why it's really important to have a consultation with your therapist, is because they need to explain this to you that I don't know you, right?
Yeah.
And I can only do things well informed. Because imagine if you're coming to a therapist and in the first session you're disclosing these things and they're like, oh, why don't you just do deep breathing? Or why don't you just do this, right? It feels premature. So
Yeah.
there is a modality which is a humanistic approach to therapy that it's very like validating, and you sit there and you build rapport and you give that comfort. It's a lot more broader than that. I'm really minimizing it. It is a beautiful modality. Your friends might be in that kind of therapy, but your
Mhm.
friends just might be in the beginning of therapy, right? I have to take in, if you're a 25-year-old, I have to take in at least 15 to 16 years worth of life history before I go into treatment with you, because then we get caught up in a very fun stage called the bullshit stage.
Right.
Then I'm just throwing interventions at you and hoping something sticks. But I need to sit there and collect the data to have an understanding of you before I prematurely judge you and make
Mhm.
calls that aren't accurate, because that can get dangerous too. Like if I'm like, well, yeah, your parents really did all of that to you and you have a narcissistic blah 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 blah, right? You're going to get married to it. For me, like, and this is kind of why my clients hate me, some of them. They'll come in and they'll be like, "Oh, I think I'm bipolar." I'm like, "Okay, cool." Like, "Do you think I'm bipolar?"
Just
I
off
was
the
like,
bat, off the
off the
bat.
bat. Or like
TikTok
my
said.
nemesis, no, my absolute nemesis is like, oh, I have what is it, anxious avoidance, and I'm like, okay. And they're like, what do you think that means? And I was like, you know what, let's talk about, like, why do you think you're anxious avoidant? And they're like, but
Yeah.
do you think I have a diagnosis? And I'm like, does that label help you? Because I'm not trying to label you off the bat. The more things that are important for me to correct for you are that you know how to identify abuse. Okay, that's abusive. I have to say that out loud to you. Oh, that is unhealthy. That
Mhm.
is dangerous, right? And I have to, if you're telling me like a story where your uncle molested you, I have to have the appropriate reactions. Like if you're like, you know, my uncle molested me when I was like really young, I have to be like, oh my gosh, I have to have the proper facial features to match up with an extreme incident so your mind can connect the because you probably, or people normally disassociate that, oh, that was fucked up. Oh, this is actually extreme. It doesn't matter if I'm older because she's acting that way. That means it has to be hard. That is the work we're doing. So a
Yeah.
lot of the validation sometimes is like, yes, your experience was right. Yes, your experience was like this. So you understand what reality is. But
Mhm.
that can't be all of therapy. At some point, for me, because I do long term therapy, ideally the first month or 2 to 3 months is data collection where I will, go into this portion, identifying, oh, that was this, that was that, that was this. The commentary to kind of map out what there are gaps within your understanding. And then we go into, okay, now we need to help you cope.
No, no, it makes sense. It makes sense because you've like you mentioned so many things that I kind of relate to because I think one of the most painful things for people generally with therapy is that data collection part, right? Because you expect to go and you want to get answers, or sometimes there's a lot of people who are kind of really self-aware with themselves and maybe they
Oh,
just
yeah.
need some coping skills and how to move forward. So, but then when you go to a new therapist, you have to talk about who you are and what you've experienced and they need to
Yeah.
hear that. And so it's kind of painful session after session to like talk about yourself constantly and give
Yeah.
someone all this information when you're like, okay, just tell me what I need. What do I need to do, you know?
And the most self aware clients have the hardest time in therapy
Yeah.
because they're like,
Yeah.
well, I know all of this. Well, I know this came from my childhood. And they'll come and they'll be angry about it. And it's like, well, okay. So I was like, so why don't you just, it sounds like you know what to do. Why don't you just do it?
Yeah.
And it's not about a coping skill, it's about acceptance. I can
Hmm.
intellectualize everything and I can map out where I came from and all of that. But if you haven't accepted it in your mind, and if you haven't gone through a grieving process, if you haven't gone through a reevaluation of expectations, no amount of therapy will help you. You're just angry all the time. And I've worked with quite a few people who just are like, well, I know what's going on. Well, okay, what am I supposed to do with this now? And it's so much anger and it's so much hurt and it's so much like, well, give me the answer. Like, what the fuck? And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not how this works. You're
Yeah.
disconnected from your emotions. If it was all logic, you wouldn't be here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. So how do you encourage your clients to stay in the discomfort of unlearning, especially when there's pushbacks maybe with the family situation?
I think it's just exactly that. Like, yeah, that sucks. It's gonna suck.
Deal with it.
Continue.
Keep pushing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to, right? And it's such a hard thing because I'm not known for being the most like mushiest therapist. I'm a little bit more confrontational,
That's
and
good.
and I
That's the type of therapy I appreciate, but everyone has a different style. But yeah, I get
yeah,
that's a good.
every and everyone says that, right? Like I'll go in and I'll be like, "You're gonna hate me for saying this," and I always preface it, and I was like, "You're acting like your mom right now," right? And they're like, "Oh," and I'll always like shock them out of it, and I was like, "So you wanna act like someone who you despise, like?" The course of action that you're about to take is reminiscent of someone who hurt you, and that's the decision you want to make right now. And
Mhm.
they'll like pause for a second, and then I'll be like, I'll let them come to it. And I do think therapists do give not the traditional advice. I'm not trying to steer you exactly, but I am trying to like prevent you from like crashing your boat, right? Like, for example, like if I'm working with someone who's burning themselves out, I was like, this is our regimen. This is what you have to do. Like, you're killing yourself.
Yeah.
I have to direct it very be more stern with people who need it. And there are clients who I give zero validation to because they need it, because their entire thing is people pleasing. So I have to be a mirror. That's why me being that mirror is super important, is that you're coming to do the work with me. I know you love me, like, great. I don't hate you, but I'm going to pull all validation from you because your issue is being a people pleaser. And I'm not going to let you please me. I'm going to let you feel like you're disappointing me. And we're going to process what that feels like. I'm not going to say like you suck, but they're going to talk and I'm going to be like, yeah, okay, tell me more. And they're trying to get me to laugh or they're trying to get me to engage or be like bubbly and whatever. And I want to. Genuinely, there are times I'm like, oh, yeah, that was actually really funny. And then I'll laugh about it.
But you're like straight face.
Yeah, but then I'm like, okay, yeah. And I'll be like,
Mhm.
why did you tell that joke like that? And they'll be like, they'll get really uncomfortable. And they're like, I don't know, like, I thought it was a good story. It's like, it was a good story to share. and they like do like a little look because what they're trying to do is they're trying to perform for me. They're trying to watch me so they can say their next thing. And that is also a habit that you have to break. Like this work is hard when you recognize how much goes into it. And I think it is really unfortunate because I sometimes feel like this too, where it's like people minimize it as, you know, oh, you're just coming to like talk to a person and why can't you talk to friends? Like we are constantly working even in our silence. We are
Yeah.
constantly watching even when you don't think you're watching. Like a tiny shift of your face is something that we're observing.
It just came to mind, but when have you ever worked with a parent and have you ever done that? And how has that been? I don't know if you do like, would that
Yeah.
be considered group or two-person
Family.
family therapy? Yeah.
Very tough.
Yeah.
Very, very tough. Like
Yeah, I
family
can
therapy
imagine.
is the hardest. Um it's very complicated. Because this is the other shitty part about this, right? Like I know there's one person in there who if I'm not careful around will end all of this. So the fact that and it could be the child or it could be the parent. It
Yeah.
depends. And it does really make it challenging when you have to kind of tiptoe around it a little bit more. I mean, we have interventions for that and there's way to go about it, but it is really complicated when there is one more explosive person who could just end everything and one person who's trying to help the relationship without one person becoming the target of all the animosity. It's pretty tough. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially because what you said earlier about you wanting to focus on the client and their individual needs and how, you shouldn't be focused on changing your parents. You should be focused on kind of what you need and want. I can
Mm-hmm.
imagine that could be like really complicated.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to do like a quick rapid fire with you, just some
Okay.
therapist Q&As. Um, and then we'll wrap up. So I'll just give you some statements and I want your thoughts on it.
Yay.
So on therapy and healing, what's one phrase you never use as a therapist?
Ooh. What's one phrase I don't use as a therapist? Fuck, that's hard. Hmm. Oh, you should do this. I think
Okay.
should is one of that. Or like what is normal? Like, oh, this is
Mm,
normal, this isn't normal. That one. That one. Actually I take away the should. The normal one. I take
yeah,
away.
that's actually really good. Okay, what do you wish first generation clients heard more in therapy?
That it is okay to disappoint and be disappointed.
I love that. And that just goes across the board in life, not even just with your anything, really. Okay, most common aha moments with your clients.
Oh, most common. That's really hard. Oh fuck. I think the most common aha moments would be kind of, oh, that's so tough because they're all so different. Uh, I think any time that a core belief has been broken and like it's kind of like a come to Jesus moment where it's like, you know, we've done all the work and they have this like core belief that's ruining their life. And I'm just like, here. And it's a month and finally it like clicks
Mm,
that. But there's so many core beliefs. Like, you know, self hatred could be one of them. Like they don't deserve to be happy or, you know, all sorts of things.
yeah, that makes sense. Okay, last one, a cultural norm that therapy often has to help untangle.
Oh, that you need to suffer in life. I think
I don't
that's
get that.
really
Why is that such a thing?
it's part of religion. It's part of a lot of collectivistic culture. It's like, you know, you gotta, oh, what was that? Whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Like, we have like all these statements, that, uh, that glorify suffering and suffering can be like extreme hard work or whatever it is. And like hard things are fine, right? But you don't have to constantly be in survival mode or suffer or be in pain in order to achieve, no pain, no gain. That
I
like
hate that.
all these things, and when they're like, "Well, you have to," I was like, "No, you don't." I was like, "No." I was
Yeah.
like,
Or your parents are just like telling you, you hear their suffering and all they had to do to get here. So you're anything that you have that feels like suffering, you're like, okay, well, it's not that bad because they've
"Yeah,
suffered so much,
yeah,"
which is so toxic.
because suffering is a part of it, and it's just like,
Yeah,
not here for that. Not here for that at all.
totally.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much, Summer. This has been amazing. I feel like we could talk about this forever and maybe we'll do a part two one day. Where can everyone find you, reach out to you for resources, follow you, etc.?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It was such a
Yes.
pleasure. I'm so glad we were able to get this in the books.
I know.
You can find me at Therapy in Color on TikTok, and color is spelled as COLOUR, so like the British or the Canadian spelling of it. And then on Instagram, I'm Therapy in Color Official. Again, color is spelled as COLOUR. And if you go on any of those two platforms, there's links where you can contact me and watch my content, or if you ever want to come to me for therapy.
Thank you guys for listening. If you guys have any questions, definitely go to Summer's pages, ask her any questions that you guys have. I'll link everything below. And yeah, thanks for listening to another episode.
Thank you.
Bye.